Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Marxism and Disability Network panel event for April 2025. My name's Claire Williams, and I am absolutely thrilled to be chairing this evening's event. We have 3 speakers and 2 presentations this evening. The first presentation is going to be by Roddy Slorach. So Roddy is a revolutionary socialist and long-standing Socialist Worker Party member who's written widely about disability issues over the last 13 years. And a new and expanded edition of his book, A Very Capitalist Condition, A History and Politics of Disability, originally published in 2016, appeared in January 2024. Now, Roddy works as a senior disability advisor at Imperial College London and is an active member of the UCU. So Roddy's going to be speaking on Are Disabled People an Underclass for the next 20 minutes or so. So Roddy, if that's okay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thanks very much for having me, everyone. It's really nice to be here, and I can recognise some faces here and names from over the years. So really pleased that you've joined. I'm not sure if this is somewhat behind the curve, really, this meeting, because looking at the meetings you've had recently, when I first submitted this, I thought it might be a bit more controversial or topical, but I think that you've probably covered a fair bit of this ground already. So I think that what I should perhaps say at the outset is that I think that some of what I'm going to say does have implications for the analysis put forward in books such as Health Communism and also in Robert Chapman's book on neurodiversity. So what I really therefore want to start with, quite obviously, is the government's massive cuts to benefits, which have taken place recently. Up to 1 million people, probably around 1 million actually, up to 1.2 million people going to be losing up to £6,300 a year by 2030. That is absolutely incredible, much worse than anything the previous government had done, because of the combined effects it will actually have in other benefits and other and gateway as a gateway impact. So really the whole overall effect of this could mean some claimants losing £9,600 a year. I don't need to tell you that all the idea that this is based on fraud is nonsense. Basically, the current PIP fraud figures for PIP are 0% according to the DWP. That's the Department of Work and Pensions here in the UK. Sorry. And the thing about it is that we know that far more money has always gone unclaimed in benefits than actually is claimed. In other words, the problem is the opposite of Costa del Dole, if you like. The problem is that many people do not claim benefits because of stigma and discrimination, and the idea, in other words, that they are spongers, they are people who are scrounging from the state, as the tabloids are fond of saying. Now, the thing about all this really is it does kind of reinforce the idea that disabled people are one kind of homogenous group. And they're sometimes described on our side, if you like, as the hardest hit by austerity and by everybody really widely assumed to be out of work. Now, that stereotype, it's important to say, does have some basis, in fact, because first of all, a large proportion of disabled people are over retirement age. Secondly, disabled people account for about 1/3 of the poorest households in Britain, according to the Resolution Foundation, I think that is. And the other thing is that almost half of all working age disabled people are actually unemployed. However, the other side of it is that disabled adults also comprise 1 in 7 of the UK workforce. So how do Marxists therefore actually look at disabled people in terms of class? Now, what I'm going to look at, therefore, is the approach taken in particular by 3 different authors. Frances Ryan, who some of you might know, who's a columnist for The Guardian. Ellen Clifford, who's a leading activist with Disabled People Against Cuts, very award-winning book recently called The War Against Disabled People, and more recently Robert Chapman's work. Okay, so what I therefore want to start with is just something that I hope we can all agree on, which is that with the rise of capitalism, labour power becomes a commodity. It becomes something to be bought and sold, and people with impairments therefore became disadvantaged in two crucial ways. First of all, the labour power is identified as more expensive due to the extra cost of adjustments, even if they're very trivial in most cases. Employers don't want to pay that extra cost. The second is that the labour power costs more to reproduce. That's the extra cost of medical assistance, personal support, equipment, travel costs, extra diet costs, etc. And that's partly to do with the workplace and partly to do with the social costs of labour, the reproduction of the labour force more widely, which obviously this is part of what the government wants to pass on as much as possible to individual disabled people. So Martha Russell discussed disabled people as people who were excluded from social spheres. I see that kids here, because they have little value to the capitalist class as workers. And that exclusion and isolation means, again, quote, disabled workers and would-be workers do not have the social and political power to realise their economic wants. Now, that approach, I think, is quite common to a lot of the disability scholars we're familiar with. Finkelstein, Paul Aberley's critique of Michael Oliver's approach to the social model, Colin Barnes, and also Martha Russell and Leonard Davis as well. That's kind of common to all these people. So I want to go into the question of the underclass itself, a really horrible front cover there from a long time ago in the Time magazine, but really giving the idea that, that the notion of the underclass has always been something quite a negative thing. Now, Frances Ryan wrote in her book Crippled that disabled people's exclusion from the labour market is perpetuating a disabled underclass. Now, what that really meant, and she spells it out in the book, she means an impoverished social group outside the working class, permanently unemployed and reliant on state benefits. And that kind of characterisation of an underclass as deviant and criminal really goes right back to Victorian notions of the undeserving poor. More recently, of course, it appeared there were a group demonised as chavs with the last Labour government's attacks on welfare dependency. And Ryan really reinforces this idea of disabled people as a homogenous social group, really as a kind of static sociological concept. But many disability authors do actually forget. I mean, it's quite amazing how often this is forgotten. Most working age claimants are actually in work, and low pay forces millions of people to rely on tax credits and housing benefit. But the testing regime that has wrecked so many of the lives of disabled people, documented in both of these books by Clifford and Ryan, has also been applied to benefits affecting non-disabled people. So, you know, the whole humiliating regime is something that's been applied to the wider working population, the wider working class, if you like. Now, Ellen Clifford takes a different view, and her view is that really Marx's reserve army of labour, as she says, is fundamental to understanding government policies affecting out-of-work benefits. And she describes that really as Marx's a definition of a reserve army of labour as a disposable army of benefit claimants, really, to give it modern terminology, pulled into work or expelled according to the needs of capital. The reserve army of labour strengthens employers by pressing down on wages, threatens those in work with being replaced if they complain or if they seek higher wages. Now, the reserve army of labour includes unemployed and part-time, minimum waged or zero-hour workers who are unable to find more secure and better paid work. So young people and migrants are other groups that are likely to form part of that army. Now, the advantage with that concept compared to the previous one of the underclass is that it explains short-term changes. For example, some disabled people have been forced into largely low-paid and unskilled jobs in recent years as a consequence of the government changes to benefits. But there's also more fundamental long-term trends. So women, for example, were once a very large part of the reserve army, but now they're a majority of the workforce. And many disabled people actually did join the workforce during World War I and World War II, in the advanced capitalist countries in particular. And that really became a more permanent feature during the long economic boom of after World War II. So disabled people are a significant proportion, in other words, of the working population. So unemployment rates, nevertheless, do remain very high compared to most other social groups. 47%, the latest figures say. And that's much higher, obviously, as we know, for particular impairment groups, such as people who are autistic, something like 17%, 15% employment rate. People who are blind, people who are deaf also have even more horrendous unemployment figures. The other thing, however, is that over half of working age disabled people are actually in employment. And that's much more likely amongst people who have some kind of qualification. According to government figures, 73% of disabled people who have a degree are in work, and many of them are actually in skilled or professional jobs. Now, there are also now many more disabled people where I work in university, many more disabled students attending. The number has doubled between 2010 and 2022. And now there are, out of all the higher education students in England, 1 in 5 of them are actually disabled. So many disabled people, in other words, do not belong to the Reserve Army of Labour and are instead a permanent part of the British workforce. Now, for all of this, I suspect that pretty much everyone here is going to agree with what I've said so far. But the other thing about it really is that the whole notion of a surplus caste. In other words, this idea that disabled people are a group separate from the working class and to be considered as a distinct social group. So in Empire of Normality, Robert Chapman sees neurodivergent people as part of the Reserve Army of Labour due to the way in which capitalism both creates and extracts from the surplus class while simultaneously abandoning them. And this is pretty much what's said in Health Communism, isn't it? Very similar argument. So for Chapman, neurodivergent people are part of a distinctive surplus class with the potential power that Marx saw in the proletariat. And that is similar to older attempts to argue that, the unemployed or the most oppressed, the lumpen proletariat, for example, or the most oppressed group in society. So therefore, should be the focus of liberation struggles. And Chapman actually cites the American Black Panther Party and their orientation on what they called the brothers in the bloc. And arguably, I think that strategy actually made them particularly vulnerable to state oppression. Now, Chapman and Vierkant and Adler-Bolton really put versions of arguments, in my view, that are very similar to those from thinkers in the autonomous tradition, going right back to Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's writings in the early 2000s. Hart and Negri argued that capitalist restructuring led to wage labour becoming submerged really in this formless multitude, in the title of the book, comprising all those who exercise any creative capacity under capitalism. Now, what I think is that these positions really effectively abandon the Marxist notion of a specific structural capacity, which is obtained by workers by virtue of their position in the process of production. In other words, it's the place of working class people in the capitalist mode of production that determines class. And class is something that obviously has to be defined by two things. By one class defines another, if you like. The ruling class defines the working class, those who take the profit, those who make it. So the other thing here is that I think that the arguments about precarity, and the arguments about precarity have certainly accumulated in recent years. There are clearly pressures on capitalists to employ people in insecure roles. But the other aspect of this is that lots of capitalists, however much they might want to, nevertheless do rely on a trained and stable workforce which can reproduce itself, so they can't simply hire and fire at will. And that capital-labour relation, therefore, is one of mutual interdependence. It's not a relation, in other words, in which capital is all-powerful and labour is abject. So I think that what I would say, therefore, is that despite the very, very low levels of working class struggle and strikes in particular in recent decades, today's working class is nevertheless larger and potentially more powerful than in Marx's time. The problem is that we've seen very little of that in recent decades. Whoops, what happened there? I think my slides have just gone. Sorry, my apologies. So last thing I just want to say, which isn't in this slide for some reason, I seem to have omitted a slide. In contrast, last point I wanted to make really is about the whole concept, if you like, of nothing about us without us. Are all disabled people, if you like, included in the us in that slogan? Now, both Clifford and Ryan tend to assume that all disabled people are either poor or a separate part of the broader working class. unlike, as I can see anyway, as the case with Chapman. I know that you had a debate about whether that's actually true of the approach in health communism. But the point really is here, I think, is that wealthier disabled people are always less likely to see disability as a class issue, much more likely to view it as one of securing what Martha Russell calls free market civil rights that are more or less compatible with the status quo. And it's that middle class layer which kind of, with this focus on individual rights, which has traditionally dominated disability movements. So Clifford talks about these divergent class interests in a later chapter in the book, which exposes the myth of the purple pound and the record of the disability charities. And in my view, these organisations are a never-present reminder of how far we are from a situation of rights, not charity, but they're also likely to remain an important resource for many disabled people for so long as capitalism exists. So the last sentence then, the issue of labour in a socialist society has often been raised as a key problem for disabled people. Now, I don't have time to discuss how a socialist society would dismantle class relations, but I think one key concept is that of socially useful labour. And that, in my view, would mean something very different in a society where production is based on meeting the needs of the vast majority rather than the profit needs of a small and very tiny minority in society. So I'll leave it there. I hope that's been of some use.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Roddy. Very, very rich and thought-provoking presentation. I have so many questions, but those will have to wait for now. What I suggest is that we hear from Bob and Sandra. I'm delighted to introduce Bob Williams-Findlay and Sandra Wyman. So Bob has been a leading disability activist in Britain for 30 years, appearing on TV and being a keynote speaker at numerous conferences. And he's written numerous articles on disability politics and social oppression and published Disability Praxis in 2023. And Sandra Wyman is an active member of ACT for Inclusion. Her political background has included trade unionism, especially around women and other equality issues. She firmly sees an eco-social approach towards disability as a vital next step. Thank you so much both for speaking. Please give me a shout when you'd like me to move on to the next slide.
Okay. Thank you, Claire. Sorry I was late. I've had problems getting online. Today, all we can do is frame the debate, so broad brushstrokes. So, while international research is making a more concerted effort to actively include some populations in communication and strategies, the disability community have been consistently omitted. The wide-ranging exclusion is concerning as climate change is expected to affect disabled people in 3 ways. One, most likely to have limited access to knowledge, resources and services to effectively respond to environmental change. More vulnerable to extreme climate events, ecosystem service loss or infectious diseases. Third, more likely to have difficulty during required evacuation or migration. Next slide, please.
In a United Nations survey, a high proportion of disabled people were found to either be injured or even die during natural disasters. This was due to a lack of consciousness of consultation with disabled people and governments that lacked necessary measures to support and protect them. Only 20% of respondents to the survey said that they could evacuate immediately, and 6% said they could not evacuate at all. The needs of disabled people are often not considered, such as accessible evacuation centres, transport for the individual and any essential equipment they might need to manage their impairment and health conditions, information in formats that they can read and understand, for example, communication tools for deaf and visually impaired people.
Disability justice originates in America. It centers intersectionality in a very diverse system of oppression, amplify and reinforce one another. The term disability justice is often used interchangeably with terms such as disability rights and disability inclusion. Yet, it's important to recognize that disability justice refers to a very specific framework for thinking about disability in America, which might conflict with the British radical social model of disability.
Lateef H. MacLeod, an American activist and writer, wrote an article entitled Social Ecology and Disability Justice, Making a New Society, in which he explores commonalities between social ecology and disability justice in their respective visions for liberation. He explains, focusing on the shared components of anti-capitalist critique, mutual aid or interdependence, and ecological sustainability, I'll illustrate how these two movements can align to build a more just, egalitarian, and ecologically sustainable world. I argue that social ecology and disability justice share a variety of values and goals that make them natural partners in struggles for collective liberation.
However, tensions between climate justice and disability justice that exist. This is a club. Unless we can get disabled people working and integrated in the core fabric of the environmental sector, we're not going to be able to make these connections, and we're not going to see how environmental justice and inclusion is linked so closely to disability, equality, and inclusion.
Lateef argued, for social ecologists to be in solidarity with the disability community, they must consider disability justice principles in any transition from capitalism. Social ecologists and other parts of the left also need to include the disability community more in their organisational strategies and making changes to ensure this goal is achieved. At a basic level, this requires paying more attention to access needs people may need in your group. This reflects the 9th disability justice principle of collective access. The principle of collective access is not simply about ensuring physical access into buildings or transportation, nor is it just about developing inclusive practice either. collective access has to be created by recognizing the inequalities that exist in power relationships, the fact that diverse groups of people are impacted upon by normative values and oppressive practices differentially. Inclusive practice requires addressing intersectional issues, managing conflicts of need and interest, as well as drawing on the creative imagination and experience of different groups of people. Vic Finkelstein in 1980 said, "The requirements are for changes to society, material changes to the environment, changes in environmental control systems, changes in social roles, and changes in attitudes by people in the community as a whole." The focus is decisively shifted onto the source of the problem, the society in which disability is created.
We can see numerous connections between environmental problems, the creation of impairment, and the deepening of disablement, but only being acknowledged. If environmental justice seeks the fair treatment of all people, with respect to environmental decisions and policy, then disabled people must be part of the discussion, and yet they are regularly excluded from decision-making and face discrimination. Unless this is addressed, it could mean climate solutions and adaptation plan will be designed without any in mind, and they may not have equal access to green drugs and opportunities of a just transition. For climate movement, it means they are missing valuable perspectives, talent, and experience that could broaden and enrich their agendas and increase their power to create systemic change.
The Campaign Network Act for Inclusion adopted a new vision in 2021 to transform social care and assert self-directed living via an eco-social approach. This approach is still very much in its infancy. Before looking at what might underpin an eco-social approach, we believe there's a need to consider how the radical social model has been understood, or should that be misunderstood, alongside attempts to put into usage. Part of the dialogue needed, we would suggest, centres around the meanings given to the term models. Vic Finkelstein and Mike Oliver appear to differ on this issue. Finkelstein, for example, wrote, "Models are constructed so that an object can be looked at in different ways and under different conditions. Models are artificial and don't explain anything. Model airplanes, for example, are constructed to see how they might behave in a wind tunnel. The model airplane will not explain the laws governing flight, although they might provide the insight from which the laws of flight are inspired. A good model can enable us to see something which we don't understand, because in the model it can be seen from different viewpoints, not available to us in reality. And it is this multidimensional replica of reality that can trigger insights which we might not otherwise develop. Mike's social model of disability has provided the disability movement with an invaluable tool which has strengthened our insight into the struggle for emancipation." Finkelstein concluded, "Models then are the next stage in gaining insight into a complex situation. Theories then are a later stage in trying to provide an explanation of a complex situation. the social model of disability repossessed. Mike Oliver, on the other hand, wrote, "We have spent too much time talking about the social model and its usefulness, and indeed its limitations, and not devoted enough attention to actually implementing or attempting to implement it in practice." He went on to say, "The more detailed elaboration of the social model stemmed from attempts to apply this insight into practice, firstly in training of social workers, and secondly, in the design and delivery of disability equality training. We want to query Oliver's understanding of the social model in action. Is this not a separate stage beyond modelling and gaining insights via exploration? What is the methodology employed to put it into action?"
Oliver, your opinion offered little in my methodology in terms of developing a disability practice. Perhaps this is the closest. Using the generic term disabled people does not mean that I do not recognize differences experience within the group, but exploring this, we should start from the way of pressure, differential impact on different group of people, rather than the differences experienced among individuals with different impairments. Oliver's social model therefore seems to acknowledge exploring the way different groups of disabled people encounter social restrictions, disabling barriers in terms of participation in mainstream society, community work and leisure, etc. Perhaps if this was done, the main avenue have been through learning by disability equality training. But was this really an adequate grounding for disability practice? Here's where the eco-social approach can be critically introduced. As this illustration suggests, disability equality training attended to focus on environmental, structural, and attitudinal barriers. Also, environmental, structural, and attitudinal barriers that impinge upon the life of disabled people be addressed to ensure disabled people gain the maximum possible independence in daily living activities to achieve ability to undertake productive work and to liberate and how they choose with full control over their lives. Disabled people identify barriers to independent living and what is required to address them. But is known as the 12 pillars of independent living. What the 12 pillars set out addressing the barriers, there is no acknowledgement of the fact individual and group interact with different social and natural environment and systems. This is where ecological theory can assist the social model of disability?
The social model has been used to address how environmental, structural, and attitudinal barriers impinge upon the lives of disabled people. However, little attention was paid to the various systems or levels within society where these social restrictions are encountered. At a micro level, we're seeking to address the personal lifestyles of individuals in terms of where they live, what support they need, their relationships with other people, and so on. At a medium level, the encountered restrictions may occur within neighbourhoods, communities, groups of people, or accessing work, leisure activities, etc. At a macro level, we're considering the impact of existing health and social care systems, laws, market forces, state perspectives, etc. There are interactions and impacts across all three levels. Without strong and organised voices to defend them, disabled people, children, women, and older people, the outcome for these groups could be catastrophic, especially in the poorer nations of the world, where abject poverty is the norm rather than the exception for those at the foot of the social hierarchy. In these circumstances of worsening climate change, as Len Barton wrote in relation to sociology, but could equally be applied to disability praxis, we urgently need a political analysis which is inspired by a desire for transformative change and that constitutes hope at the centre of struggles. At both the individual and collective level, a crucial task is to develop a theory of political action, which also involves the generation of tactics or strategies for its implementation. This is a difficult but essential agenda. Developing a radical eco-social approach towards a new system capable of producing and sustaining community-based services needs to be part of this process.
The new eco-social system will develop policies and practices aimed at facilitating the removal of barriers and co-producing inclusive practices, a holistic, interactive approach to diverse lifestyle. For example, social support services within mainstream communities, universal public services like the NHS, eco-life housing, free accessible transportation, a transformative social security system, access to justice, education and training, access to paid employment and other opportunities, sustainable communities, and accessible natural environment.
We can't achieve social change by using the same structures that exclude people. Rather, it can be achieved by replacing these with more egalitarian structures. Maria Barile, disability activist, feminist, researcher, and visionary.
That's it, folks. That is our presentation.
Thank you so much, Bob and Sandra. Another fantastic presentation, really rich, and so many questions come out of that. I am so sorry. The minute I started screen sharing, my PowerPoint decided to crash. So I apologize for losing the first 3 slides. So I think I caught up with you by slide 4. Okay. Shall we take a short break now and come back for questions and a discussion with the presenters? Welcome back. Let's make a start on the discussion. We've had 2 fantastic, really rich presentations from Roddy on disabled people in Underclass, and then from Bob and Sandra on an eco-social approach to system change. So I am going to throw the floor or the meeting room open to questions. Please feel free to raise a hand or turn your camera on and wave at me or pop a question in the chat. I will try and keep an eye on all of those. And I'll kick off with Luke.
Thanks, Claire. Appreciate it. So I have a question for both, well, all three presenters for both presentations. Roddy, I'll kick off with you. You and I are on the same side on, I think, nearly all of this. I think we both believe that disablement, like gender and like race, is an excrescence on the class relation, right? You can't directly match up the dynamic categories Marx and Engels use for class to describe social relations which are built on class but are not directly the class relation itself. I think we're at one on that. But I want to put to you, I think, probably the strongest defense of the surplus class claim, and then see, you can tell me how you would respond to this. And I think the strongest version, and you can get this from Robert Chapman's book, I think if you amend it slightly, would be something like this. Surplus populations necessarily reveal themselves during periods of crisis, right? So it's not, the surplus population is not a stable category. It moves with declining productivity, surplus capital, organic relations of organic composition of capital, and all of that kind of stuff. So saying that one social group falls constantly into the surplus class category is not to say that, you know, the conditions of that group will remain the same over time. It's simply to say that whenever there is a crisis, you will see that group relatively deprived through the crisis mechanism. So whenever there is an economic crisis, you find it will be disabled people who pay the bill for that. Whenever there's a social crisis, you will find that it is services that disabled people use which will be the first to suffer, and everyone within that group is affected by that to some degree or other. I think that takes away some of the more superficial versions of the surplus population claim, but keeps the core of it, right? It says that this social group is consistently contained within this category that we can get from Marx and Engels. So I'd be really interested to hear what your kind of pushback would be on that variant. Bob and Sandra, really enjoyed your presentation. And like you, I'm convinced that, you know, actually applying the social definition, as it were, means we have to move past these models with one set of inputs and one set of outputs, right? Like, so barriers and then either disablement or liberation, and that we need to take into account a wide variety of spheres of social activity, spheres of social life in order to do that. Looking at your presentation, though, I wasn't quite sure where political economy came in. I wasn't quite sure where capital came in. It seems to me that decisions which are made about investment, the labor process in order to create surplus value, and the social wage, right, as it were, like the value of labor power, were themselves crucial in determining how ecosystems are formed. Do you see kind of the operations of capital as you know, investment, extraction, consumption, etc.? Do you see those as being spread across all of the category areas that you outlined at the end, or do you see them as being perhaps concentrated above or without of that nexus? Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Luke. Roddy, would you like to pick that up first?
Yeah, sure. I can have a go at dealing with that. It's a very good question, I think. I mean, the first thing I want to say about this is that I think that there have been a number of attempts to abandon what you might call a classical Marxist approach to the working class, that the proletariat, in other words, is a universal class capable of achieving a new society based on its unique historical nature, which is you can't take a bit of a typewriter away with you, if you like. You know, you have to fight collectively. And this is the thing about it. You can't, like a peasant, fight for a little bit of land. You have to fight collectively. Now, the thing about this, therefore, is that it really comes back to the conception of class as something that is defined by an individual or a group of people's relationship with the means of production. In other words, you know, the position of people within the capitalist relations of production. And that therefore raises a question: what is the basis of the power of a surplus class? Because if it's not defined in this manner, then you really get into all sorts of definitional, murky, swampy areas, really, that don't particularly clarify, in my view. And I think the thing about it is that if you think, for example, about Luke's argument, the suggestion that Luke made there, well, during a crisis, this group's going to be heavily impacted than others, well, that's probably true. But it's also probably true that it would be true of any other set of oppressed groups, And at the moment, for example, we would say that migrants, Muslims, and trans people are likely to be those most vividly and spectacularly affected by the crisis, because there are those groups that are victimized by the far right. There are those that people like Trump have got in their sights, and there are those that the absolute swine like Starmer and so on are falling over themselves to say, we'll go along with that too. Please don't hit us with more tariffs. So the point I'm making, therefore, is that it's a bit, I think that the difficulty with this argument is that it tends to emphasize the separateness of a group rather than its interconnectedness with class relations. And to me, therefore, that is a fundamental problem with the surplus class argument. It is, if you like, a dedicated form of fashion. It's very fashionable in Marxist circles at the moment to talk about post-Fordism, post-capitalism, cognitive capitalism, emotional labor. But these are all things that tend to argue that the character of capitalism has changed, that we're talking about a new era of capitalism in which we do not see exploitation at the heart of it, but instead start to talk about concepts which are somewhat removed from that, because we're living in a qualitatively different, technologically advanced society and so on. Anyway, I'm rambling on too much, but basically I don't agree with the concept of the surplus class. I don't think it's one that's particularly helpful to us. I think I welcome the fact that people are trying to bring about a more sophisticated understanding of all the different parts of modern day capitalism. But I think that really it's a concept which doesn't particularly aid us in terms of looking for alternatives and the power that exists to be able to challenge society as it is.
Thanks so much, Roddy. Bob and Sandra, would you like to come back to Luke?
No, because I didn't hear his question.
I'll repeat it, Bob. So basically, I was wondering at the end, you lay out kind of a typology, right? All of the different areas which an social approach would need to take account of. And I didn't see exactly where economic decision making or economic phenomena were in that makeup. So you had the four levels. You've got social policy at the top, organizations beneath, the neighborhood level, and then the individual choice. And I wondered whether for you guys, questions of where investment is put and how it is structured, or how labor processes, how workplaces are organized, etc., do those cut across all of those levels for you, or do you see them as being kind of fundamentally separate?
Well, we were addressing them, so it's primarily about inclusive living for disabled people and their positioning. So a transitional approach. But if I was to give you a top of my head approach, then yes, there'd be an interrelation between, the different layers. And on top of the national layer, there'd be a global layer where hopefully, if we do transform into more socialist, communist society, then we will look at ways of integrating the way we create work, the value of work, and have more co-productive world rather than a competitive market. And coming from being brief, we agree with Roddy that work itself needs to be redefined, and what meaningful activities are, it needs to be redefined. So work under capitalism is purely exploitative, where we want it to be part of everyday life in whatever capacity that is possible.
Thanks so much, Bob. Sandra, is there anything that you'd like to come in on? I think you're muted, Sandra.
Guilty, right. One of the things we've worked on a lot in Art for Inclusion is how the various layers link up and how we can get through the barriers between them. And I mean, and the techniques we have actually been working on. And can you bear in mind I'm a student rather than an academic, please? So I may be answering more simply, but the idea that there doesn't need to be that hierarchy, that there needs to be communication between the different levels, that it's not, I mean, we're so used to seeing it as being top down. The idea that disabled people, aren't just there to have things done to us, because that's what it's like at the moment, but we need to be involved in actually communicating with people at every level. And that needs to be done in an atmosphere of respect. Now, it's quite a hard ask, but it's possible to work on it. We can work on it in small areas and expand from there, but it is very important it should happen.
Thank you, Sandra. Just to say that I still feel very much a student as well. So
Me too.
Solidarity there. Thank you. There's loads of hands raised. I'm just going to read out a couple of the comments. Roddy's already replied to this one, but Linda has written in the chat, the rhetoric around the disabled now seems not unlike the far right's rhetoric around immigration. Is the othering of minorities a symptom of a polarized society rather than being a left or versus right issue? And Roddy's replied to that to anyone who can't see the chat, and I'm not sure the chat's being recorded. So for the recording. Yes, Linda, I agree with the first part of that. The language around the cost, in inverted commas, of disability to the economy, for example, the new DWP report is reminiscent of that used in Nazi Germany quote unquote useless eaters. So I'll come to some of the hands up. Julie first, and then Ariana, and then James.
Hi, I'm going to follow up a little bit on what Luke was asking, and maybe be a little bit more pointed or blunt. So Luke was asking about where political economy fits in, and I understand what you're saying, Bob and Sandra, about wanting to get, the importance of having disabled people involved and included. But I think what Roddy's presentation is pointing to is the key question is included in what? Because as your presentation is framed now, perhaps unintentionally, what you are suggesting is that disabled people be included in struggles for rights to be exploited along with everyone else in capitalism, because the levels of analysis, and I agree you need to look at different levels of analysis. What you have as the highest level of analysis it includes market forces. It doesn't include relations of wage, labor, and capital. So in the end, I think your presentation and your argument is actually opposed to Roddy's. And I would say that in part, you seem to be drawing on intersectionality, which is very much similar to autonomism and assemblage theory in that they focus on power relations only and not the underlying relations of exploitation. So, and we're all still students. I should leave it there, but I do have a suggestion for like a reading you might look at in terms of a really strong critique of intersectionality, Martha Jimenez's work, for instance. So my question is, I don't know, that's more of a critique than a question. I'm not sure that was an intentional, I guess I would say, with Bob and ask Bob and Sandra, do you see the your position as opposing it, and do you understand why I see it as opposing? And
no, because I don't think it is. Because our focus is on a transitional situation. So we are framed in an anti-capitalist framework. It is, I don't want to fit disabled people into capitalism because it can't happen. It's a nonsense. That is what the disability dialectic says. You can't be integrated into a system. It don't want you, it can't use you. So I'm totally at one with what Brody was saying there. But what we are arguing is at the moment we have a system that is two-tier. On the one hand, you've got disabled people who've got high level of support needs being warehoused. And on the other hand, you've got a market facing independent living system idea whereby the focus is mainly on personal assistance, enabling people to fit into the status quo rather than looking at a system whereby we overthrow the market system and we create a sustainable environment and that we co-produce in our community that support so people can live within their locations and participate on the same level or to the same value as non-disabled people. The eco-social approach is not a total socialist program. It's mainly about changing social relations so that disabled people can participate.
I understand then that your intention is to take an anti-capitalist perspective, but I'm just going to add that I don't think that the conceptual framework that you're using right now is effective for that purpose, because for instance the fundamental split that you're talking about there is between abled and disabled, as opposed to bourgeois and proletariat, capitalist and worker, and that that's what I hear saying. And just on another point regarding intersectionality, if I'm understanding you correctly, you said and disability justice. The disability justice movement you seem to be saying is coming out of the US and maybe effective for that context. I'm in the US, not that that matters that much, but I don't think that the disability justice framework, which takes as some of its key concepts, those of intersectionality, I don't think it's effective for the US perspective or anywhere else. So that it's got the same basic issues that intersectionality and autonomism and these others do. So
Thank
that's it.
Thank you so much, Julie, for those great questions. Bob and Sandra, forgive me for diving in. I wonder if we could get in a couple more questions first and then come back to you to respond to all of them. I've just got an eye on the time here. Ariana.
Yes, thanks very much. So I'll remove the. I am very slow. Yeah, I will remove spotlight. Okay, yes. Yes. Yes, thanks all three of you for amazing presentations. So my so I have so I think my question is I have one for each presentation. Maybe I will start with Sandra and Bob because it connects to what we've been discussing with Julie's question and Luke's as well. So my question is, I really liked your idea of using ecological and radical social model together and where you ended. I really found the different levels helpful and the end on the idea of a community-based eco-social system as what could provide a space where we can advance social change or one for social justice and even disability justice from other perspectives. So my question is whether you think that level, the community one, whether you think that from an anti-capitalist perspective, that level, so the community one provides a better space in which to develop anti-capitalist relations of social reproduction, maybe especially. So where we put care first, where we assert the primacy of social reproduction as opposed to profit, and even where we organize relations of production alternatively vis-a-vis the capital labor relation. So my question, I think, is whether you end with the idea of a community-based eco-social model, so at a specific which privileges one of the levels, even if they are interconnected. But yeah, my question is whether you think that the community level has more scope for anti-capitalist organizing and relations of social reproduction, maybe. That's my question for you too, and for Roddy, my question is, I'll apologize if it's a silly question. So I was wondering if you could expand on how, as disabled people, starting from the one of the major points of your research and the presentation itself, that disabled people are disadvantaged under capitalism because of the two ways in which their labor power is more expensive, and also there are additional costs to reproduce a disabled labor force. So my question is then, starting, bearing this in mind, how can we develop our anti-capitalist force as part of the proletariat, in the sense that how can we see ourselves as having, as needing to develop our anti-capitalist power, of course, collectively with others, starting from our capacity to sell our labor power. Yes, so I know it's silly, but I was wondering if it's our weak point, how can that be the starting point for our presence within the proletariat as as a key force within anti-capitalist struggle? Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Arianna. And just for reasons of time, I'm gonna come to James first. Is it a quick question? Because I know you've been waiting. And then I'll go back to the presenters to respond to those questions.
No, yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Claire. I'll try to keep it brief. It's really interesting too, because maybe this will. I think it's in complement to Julie, Luke's, and Ariana's question as well. It was around specifically the subject of the underclass itself, but I think all the respondents could respond if they're open to it. I was thinking about Ellen Meekson Wood's work on the creation of an underclass, and essentially that the underclass exists within an already present proletariat. And so rather than Adler, Bolton, and Verkamp's discussion or Chapman's discussion that follows Ruth Wilson Gilmore's argument about organized abandonment and scraping value off of surplus populations, Wood's work is interesting because it argues that there's this controlled propagation or visibility that both is utilized or allows capital to exploit political but also ideological dispositions for capital to make use of. And so I was just thinking if anybody's, because I think it might help answer some of the questions posed if anybody's looked at Ellen's work in relation to this.
Thanks so much. Roddy, and then I'll come to Bob and Sandra to reply. Roddy, you're on mute again.
Sorry, my apologies. I forgot to put my mic on again. Yeah, I guess I would be categorized as one of the old-fashioned dinosaur Marxists in the sense that I believe that the most important place that working people can wield power is in the workplace. So that therefore does mean that people that are not directly involved in the generation of profits or in a contribution towards realizing these profits don't have the same degree of power. Now that doesn't mean that movements of the oppressed are not tremendously important. And if you think about how these can mesh together, for example, some of the leaders of the Chartist revolts in Britain were actually Irish immigrants, for example, or slaves, in fact. If you think about that, if you think about the fact that, a matter of a few years after some of the worst pogroms in world history against Jewish people, some of the leaders of the Russian Revolution were themselves Jewish. Then I think that it's important to recognize how social struggles on a massive scale can bring the people that are at the bottom of society to the top, if you like, precisely because of the necessity of a revolutionary force actually taking on all the arguments against division and isolation and marginalizing of people who are very much part of our side. In other words, I would say that the reason you have to fight disability discrimination is quite a simple one. Whatever you think about disabled people, or whether you exercise feelings of pity or whatever, any of these sort of reactionary notions, the point is we cannot win if we do not actually make sure that we fight all forms of oppression. So therefore, we have to be what I would say are tribunes of the oppressed. That is the only way that we can actually win. So there needs to be therefore a meshing of the social movements with the power of workers in the workplace, in my view, if we are going to have a successful challenge to capitalism, because that's where our power essentially lies. And I think that all the arguments here, which are diluting, if you like, or questioning that, flow very much from a situation where for the last an awful lot of years, since the mid-70s, certainly in this country, we have not seen major strike movements challenge the nature of capital. And the reality is that the bulk of the disability rights movement has emerged since these high points of struggle. And that, I think, has coloured many of the arguments that have taken place and some of the dislocation that has taken place between concepts of class and social groups. Hope that's of some help.
Thanks so much, Roddy. I'm going to come to Bob and Sandra and then wrap up. And I think Luke's got an announcement. Julie, I'm going to assume that's a legacy hand. Sophia, I think because of timing being so tight, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure we're going to have time. Is it something you can pop in the chat while Bob and Sandra are responding to the questions very briefly? So sorry, yeah, Bob and Sandra to respond to the questions.
Okay, very quickly. We didn't say we were totally in favour of a disability justice approach. We say raises issues that connect with the debate about an eco-social approach and the issue of intersectionality, I believe, is about recognizing how different oppression intersect and work. But I want to end by saying most of our ideas are in their infancy, and we believe that the later work of Rick Finkelstein around his ideas needed to be looked at again, and maybe the framing of his argument needs to be changed, because I personally feel his language loses people, and we need to look at how we change things. And at the moment, of the debate about independent living, I think is we are set lots of people here, but I think it has been taken out of the social interpretation of disability and become narrowly focused on personal support rather than the idea of community-based services. So what I remember saying, I think you're right. I think we can change the relationship at a local level.
Thanks so much, Bob. And Sandra, I'll give you the last.
There's not much I want to add. I think Bob's made the major points. So there was one thing that occurred to me when we talk about communities. There is not an equal sort of level of communities. It depends where you find yourself. If you live in the middle of, I don't know, rural North Oxfordshire, as I did, the communities are stratified very differently to, say, in a town or in a city where, or in a, like a mining community where you've got that solidarity effectively. So it's very difficult to actually make overall comments about communities and the structure and where they are, because it varies so much. Not sure if I'm making sense, so I'll shut up.
Oh, that's super, Sandra. Thank you so much. And I will quasi wrap up now, pre Luke's announcement. I want to thank Roddy, Bob, and Sandra for fantastic presentations and responding to the Q&A and discussion this evening. It's been really rich and really thought-provoking. Thank you to Ariana for doing the recordings and taking care of that side of things. Thank you to Roberto and the HM team for the Zoom link. And over to you, Luke, for the announcement.
Does it sound much grander than I'm going to be? Thank you, everyone. Two very quick things from us on the steering group before we let you go and get on with your evenings. Firstly, you will have seen a final reminder from Claire for the call for abstracts for the online conference that we're organising alongside the Socio-Legal Studies Association, which will be on rights discourses under neoliberalism. If you have not had a look at the call for papers yet, please do have a shifty at it. Please do consider putting something in. We're really looking forward to this conference, and we know some of you guys have some really excellent ideas, views, and positions on that theme. So please do send something in. The deadline is Friday for a 250-word abstract. The second announcement is that we have been offered by Historical Materialism a chance to organise a stream at their upcoming conference in November. It's likely that we'll organise, if we do organise anything, it will be online for access reasons. But we on the steering group are very keen that it's not just us making all of the decisions. So if you would like to be involved in organising a stream for a major conference, this would involve putting together a call for papers, checking through abstracts, deciding who you want to speak and on what, and then timetabling them, then please do drop an email to marxismdisability@gmail.com and we'll put our heads together. The snappier you can be about that if you want to be involved, the better, the quicker we can get this off the ground, the more effective it will be. I'll also send around an email with that information in it. But if that's something you'd be interested in, please do reach out. Be lovely to have more members involved in that side of the work. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Luke. And I think that's it for us to wrap up now for a great session. And there is more coming up, all available on the Marxism and Disability Network website. And there will be another session next month, I believe. Yep. Stay tuned for updates.